Hey guys, tonight, we're traveling back to the Middle Ages to investigate one of history's strangest bedtime mysteries. Imagine climbing into bed after a long day of work. The candles have been extinguished. The castle halls have grown quiet. The village outside has disappeared into darkness. And instead of lying down comfortably beneath your blankets, you settle into bed sitting upright. At first glance, it sounds completely absurd. After all, who would willingly choose to sleep sitting up? Yet for centuries, many people believed this unusual sleeping position was healthier, safer, and even more respectable than lying completely flat. Some feared illness. Others followed medical advice. And many simply lived in a world where sleep was surrounded by traditions and beliefs very different from our own. Tonight, we'll explore medieval bedrooms, castle chambers, strange health theories, nighttime superstitions, and the fascinating reasons why so many people spent their nights resting in a way that modern sleepers would find incredibly uncomfortable. But before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe if you enjoy relaxing history content, and let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now lower the lights, settle comfortably beneath your blankets, and let's discover why people slept sitting up in the Middle Ages. The night air over medieval Europe carried a silence unlike anything most people experience today. There were no electric lights glowing beyond the windows. No distant hum of traffic. No comforting sound of modern life continuing after dark. Once the sun disappeared, darkness spread quickly across towns, forests, monasteries, and stone castles. The world became smaller, colder, more uncertain. Inside timber homes and candlelit chambers, families prepared carefully for sleep. Wooden shutters were closed against the wind. Embers in the hearth were gathered close together to preserve warmth through the long night. Dogs curled beside doorways. And somewhere beyond the fields, church bells echoed faintly through the darkness. For medieval people, nighttime did not feel peaceful in the way we often imagine today. Night was mysterious. A time when illness seemed stronger. When strange dreams arrived. When unseen dangers felt uncomfortably close, and in that uncertain darkness, many people believed the position of the sleeping body truly mattered. To modern eyes, paintings and illustrations from the Middle Ages sometimes appear oddly formal. Men and women are often shown resting in bed while partially upright, supported by pillows and heavy cushions. At first, historians assumed these artistic choices were symbolic. But over time, surviving writings, medical texts, and household records revealed something surprising. Many people genuinely preferred sleeping in a raised position, not perfectly upright like passengers on a crowded carriage, but elevated, supported, almost halfway between sitting and lying down. And the reasons behind this habit were far stranger than simple comfort. Some medieval doctors believed lying completely flat allowed dangerous bodily fluids to rise incorrectly through the body. Others feared that horizontal sleep slowed digestion and weakened the lungs. Breathing itself was sometimes viewed as safer when the chest remained lifted, but medicine was only part of the story. The Middle Ages existed in a world shaped by deep religious belief, inherited traditions, fear of sudden death, and a constant awareness of disease. The memory of plagues haunted entire generations. Even common illnesses could become fatal within days. People noticed that the very sick often struggled to breathe while lying flat. So over time, many began associating elevated sleep with survival itself. A raised posture seemed safer, more controlled, less vulnerable. And then there were the practical realities of medieval life. Beds were not the soft mattresses we know today. They were often stuffed with straw, feathers, rough wool, or dried plant material. Frames creaked loudly. Blankets trapped smoke from fireplaces. Rooms remained freezing during winter. In some homes, entire families slept together beneath shared coverings. Children, grandparents, servants, and travelers might occupy the same crowded sleeping space. Privacy barely existed. Comfort was limited. Warmth mattered more than luxury. Within those crowded rooms, sleeping partially upright also helped conserve heat. Heavy curtains around beds trapped warmth near the body. Piles of cushion supported tired backs and shoulders. People arranged themselves carefully beneath layers of linen and wool like passengers settling into a long overnight journey, and slowly, over centuries, the habit became normal. Not strange. Not uncomfortable. Simply part of life. Yet even then, not everyone agreed. Some people slept flat. Others only raised themselves slightly. Practices changed between wealthy castles, isolated monasteries, crowded villages, and roadside inns. The truth was far more complicated than modern myths often suggest, but as the candles flickered lower across medieval Europe, countless sleepers still rested against stacked pillows, believing they were protecting themselves from dangers hidden within the night, and perhaps the strangest part of all. Many of them probably drifted to sleep feeling perfectly comfortable. As the darkness deepened outside their windows, they could not possibly imagine that centuries later, future generations would look back upon their sleeping habits with fascination and disbelief. But to understand why this unusual custom survived for so long, we first need to step quietly into the medieval bedroom itself, because the beds people slept in during the Middle Ages were very different from the ones waiting for us tonight. The medieval bedroom was not the peaceful sanctuary many people imagine today. If we quietly pushed open the heavy wooden door of an ordinary sleeping chamber somewhere in 14th century Europe, the first thing we would notice would not be comfort, it would be darkness, a deep, uneven darkness broken only by candlelight and the fading glow of embers inside a stone hearth. The room itself would feel alive, timbers creaking softly overhead. Cold air slipping through cracks in the walls. Smoke lingering beneath the ceiling from countless fires burned over many winters, the scent of damp wool, straw, wax, and old wood filling the air, and somewhere inside that dim room, carefully arranged beneath layers of blankets and curtains, stood the bed. To medieval people, a bed was far more than a place to sleep. It was one of the most important objects inside the home. Sometimes it was the most expensive possession a family owned. Sometimes it represented safety itself. But medieval bedrooms looked dramatically different depending on who slept inside them. For wealthy nobles living inside castles or manor houses, bedrooms could appear surprisingly grand. Large wooden bed frames rose high above the floor, rich fabrics hung from carved posts, curtains surrounded the bed on every side, trapping warmth during freezing nights and shielding sleepers from drafts. These curtains also created privacy in buildings where privacy barely existed. Servants often slept nearby, guards waited outside chamber doors, visitors moved constantly through castle corridors, even kings and queens rarely spent time alone. Inside the bed curtains, the atmosphere became strangely enclosed. Warm breath gathered beneath heavy blankets, candles flickered against embroidered fabric. Feather mattresses sank softly beneath layers of linen, and supported by thick bolsters and stacked pillows, noble sleepers often rested in a raised position throughout the night. The arrangement looked formal, almost ceremonial. Meanwhile, far from the castles, ordinary villagers slept in rooms far smaller and harsher. Many peasant homes contained only one or two shared spaces. Animals were sometimes sheltered indoors during winter. Smoke drifted freely because chimneys were uncommon in poorer houses. Floors were packed dirt scattered with straw. At night, entire families gathered close together for warmth. Parents, children, grandparents, occasionally even visitors or travelers. The sleeping arrangements were crowded but practical. Body heat mattered. Blankets were valuable, and winter cold could become deadly. Beds themselves varied enormously. Some were simple wooden frames stuffed with straw mattresses called pallets, others were little more than sacks filled with hay placed beside the hearth. Over time the straw flattened, becoming uneven and uncomfortable. Dust and insects collected easily. Fresh bedding was difficult to maintain, yet even in humble homes, people still tried to create comfort where they could. Wool blankets were layered carefully, simple linen sheets were treasured, small cushions or rolled cloth sometimes supported the upper body during sleep. The position of the sleeper mattered because the bed itself was rarely designed for complete relaxation. Many mattresses sloped unevenly, pillows lifted the shoulders and head naturally. Sleeping slightly upright often felt practical rather than unusual. And then there was the constant cold. Modern bedrooms are carefully insulated. Medieval rooms were not. Stone walls absorbed winter air like ice. Windows remained narrow and poorly sealed. Even wealthy chambers could become bitterly cold after midnight. Bed curtains helped trap precious warmth around the sleeper. People slept wearing caps, socks, robes, and layers of underclothing. Some used heated stones wrapped in cloth. Others carried metal warming pans filled with hot coals beneath the blankets before climbing into bed. In these freezing conditions, curling upward against cushions and blankets helped preserve warmth around the chest and lungs. The sleeping posture became part of survival, a practical adaptation to uncomfortable rooms and uncertain nights. And medieval bedrooms were not silent. Wood cracked in fireplaces, rain struck rooftops. Wind pressed against shutters, animals stirred nearby. Somewhere in the darkness another sleeper coughed softly beneath heavy blankets. The night always felt present, close, unpredictable. Perhaps that is why medieval bedrooms carried such a strange atmosphere. They were places of rest, but also places of vulnerability. Illness often began there, children were born there, people died there, prayers were whispered there during storms and outbreaks of plague. Beds witnessed every stage of medieval life, and as sleepers adjusted their cushions and settled themselves upright against layered pillows, the bedroom became something more than a sleeping space. It became a fragile shelter against the immense darkness waiting beyond the walls. But the deeper we step into the medieval world, the more surprising one truth becomes. The bed itself was not merely furniture. For many families, it was treasure, protected carefully, inherited across generations, and sometimes worth more than almost everything else they owned. As the cold medieval night settled over villages and castles alike, the bed remained at the center of nearly every home, not simply as furniture, not merely as a place to rest, but as one of the most valuable possessions a person could own. To modern people, this may seem difficult to understand. Today, beds are ordinary objects, common, replaceable, something purchased, moved, discarded, and forgotten. But in the Middle Ages, a proper bed represented wealth, security, status, and survival itself. In many households, the bed was more expensive than the dining table, the chairs, and most of the family's clothing combined. Some peasants spent years slowly collecting the materials needed to create even a simple sleeping place. Wood was costly, fabric required enormous labor, feathers for mattresses and cushions had to be gathered carefully over time. Wool blankets were precious protection against freezing winters. Nothing about a medieval bed was cheap, and because of that, beds were treated with extraordinary care. Inside noble households, beds sometimes became symbols of power almost equal to crowns or thrones. Great carved frames towered above the floor. Heavy curtains of velvet or wool surrounded the sleeper like private chambers hidden inside larger rooms. Embroidery decorated blankets with family symbols and religious images. Fine linen sheets were displayed proudly to important visitors. Servants spent hours maintaining mattresses, brushing fabrics, replacing straw, warming bedding, and protecting valuable materials from insects and dampness. Some noble beds were so prized that they appeared in wills after death, parents passed them to children, kings gifted them to allies, queens traveled with their favorite bedding carried carefully from castle to castle. A luxurious bed announced status long before anyone spoke a word. But even outside the world of nobility, ordinary people viewed beds as treasures. In smaller villages, newly married couples often received bedding as wedding gifts because building a household without a bed seemed nearly impossible. Neighbors contributed blankets, relatives donated straw mattresses or wooden frames. Simple linen sheets might remain inside families for generations. Every layer mattered, and because beds held such value, sleeping arrangements became surprisingly complicated. Many households owned only one proper bed. Entire families shared it together. Parents slept beside children, grandparents rested nearby, infants were wrapped carefully between adults to protect them from cold nighttime air. Sometimes servants slept at the foot of the bed, travelers rented space beside strangers in crowded inns. Even wealthy homes occasionally placed multiple people together beneath the same curtains for warmth and practicality. Privacy was rare, space was limited, warmth mattered more than comfort. Yet despite these crowded conditions, people still took pride in creating restful sleeping spaces. Before bedtime, blankets were shaken out carefully. Mattresses were turned when possible. Pillows were arranged deliberately to support the body in a slightly elevated posture, and once again, we find the strange habit appearing quietly within the shadows of the medieval room. Sleeping upright was not only connected to health or superstition. It also matched the structure of many beds themselves. Large bolsters naturally lifted the upper body, heavy curtains enclosed sleepers in narrow spaces, thick layered blankets piled upward around the chest and shoulders. The posture became part of the environment. In some illuminated medieval manuscripts, noble figures are shown reclining almost regally while sleeping, supported by elegant cushions beneath embroidered covers. To modern eyes, these images look formal and uncomfortable, but medieval viewers likely saw something different: order, security, respectability. A carefully arranged bed reflected discipline and social standing. Lying sprawled completely flat may have appeared careless or even unsettling to some observers, and there was another reason beds mattered so deeply. People were born in them, they became ill in them, and eventually, many died in them. The medieval bed witnessed life from beginning to end. Family members gathered around it during sickness. Candles burned beside it during final prayers. Priests delivered blessings beside fading hearth fires while snow drifted quietly beyond narrow windows. Because of this, beds carried emotional importance far beyond their physical value. They became places tied to memory. A child remembered hearing winter storms while hidden beneath shared blankets. An old man remembered the warmth of the same bed beside a long-departed wife. Generations passed through the same sleeping spaces, leaving invisible traces behind them. Perhaps this explains why medieval people invested so much effort into protecting and preserving their beds. In a world filled with uncertainty, disease, famine, and brutal winters, the bed represented stability, one warm, protected corner against the dangers of the night. And somewhere inside those quiet chambers, beneath heavy curtains and layers of wool, sleepers continued adjusting their cushions and settling into elevated positions they believed offered safety and rest. The habit no longer seemed strange to them, it simply felt normal. Yet the more historians uncovered medieval medical writings, the clearer another truth became. Many people truly believed sleeping flat could be dangerous, and the strange health theories behind that belief would shape bedtime habits for centuries to come. Long before modern medicine explained the body through organs, bacteria, or scientific observation, medieval people understood health in a completely different way. To them, the human body was delicate, unstable, filled with invisible forces constantly shifting beneath the skin, and nowhere did those mysterious forces seem more unpredictable than during sleep. nighttime transformed the body into something vulnerable. A sleeping person could not defend themselves, could not fully control their breathing, could not watch for signs of illness quietly growing within. As darkness settled over Europe each evening, many believed the body entered a dangerous state between life and death itself. This fear shaped the way people slept. Much of medieval medicine was based on ancient ideas inherited from Greek and Roman physicians, especially the teachings of figures like Galen and Hippocrates. Their theories survived through monasteries, handwritten manuscripts, and generations of doctors who treated illness using traditions that were already centuries old. At the center of these beliefs stood the famous theory of the four humours. According to medieval medicine, every human body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health depended on keeping these humours balanced. Too much of one fluid could supposedly transform a person's temperament, weaken organs, or invite disease, and during sleep, many believed these fluids move differently through the body. A person lying completely flat worried some medieval doctors because they feared dangerous humours might rise improperly toward the head or chest. Digestion could slow, breathing could become restricted, the lungs might fill with unhealthy vapors. Raising the upper body appeared safer, not because people enjoyed discomfort, but because they believed elevation allowed the body to function more correctly throughout the night. To modern ears, the advice sounds strange, yet within the medieval understanding of health, it seemed perfectly reasonable. After all, people constantly witnessed illness around them. A simple cough could become fatal. Fever spread rapidly through households. Plague outbreaks haunted entire generations. Many families had watched loved ones struggle desperately for breath while lying in bed, without scientific explanations. Patterns became powerful. The sick often slept propped upright because breathing felt easier, so healthy people began doing the same in hopes of preventing illness before it arrived, and gradually, prevention became tradition. Medical texts from the Middle Ages offered surprisingly detailed instructions about sleep. Doctors debated the best hours for rest, the ideal amount of blankets, the dangers of cold nighttime air, the proper position of the body after meals. Some warned against sleeping immediately after eating because digestion was thought to generate dangerous internal heat. Others advised resting on specific sides of the body to improve circulation of the humours. The bedroom itself became part of medical treatment. Fresh air was important, but drafts were dangerous. Warmth protected the body, but overheating created imbalance. Too much sleep weakened the mind, too little exhausted the spirit. Everything required balance, and within that careful balancing act, sleeping partially upright fit naturally into medieval health theory. Especially among the wealthy, where access to physicians made medical advice more influential, beds were arranged to support elevated sleeping positions. Large cushions propped up the shoulders, bolsters lined the back, heavy blankets created a cocoon of warmth around the sleeper. The position almost resembled quiet meditation rather than ordinary rest. Yet beyond medicine, something deeper lingered beneath these practices: fear. The medieval world was filled with invisible threats people could neither understand nor control. Disease arrived suddenly. One illness could destroy an entire household within weeks. At night, every cough sounded ominous, every fever seemed dangerous. Parents listened carefully to the breathing of sleeping children beneath dim candlelight, and because death so often visited during the night, many people feared surrendering themselves completely to unconsciousness. Remaining slightly elevated may have offered psychological comfort as much as physical reassurance. The posture felt watchful, prepared, less exposed. Even dreams carried medical meaning. Some physicians believed nightmares reflected bodily imbalance or spiritual corruption. Disturbing dreams might signal illness growing inside the sleeper before symptoms appeared during daylight hours. Sleep was never viewed as simple rest. It was a mysterious biological and spiritual journey through darkness, and in the quiet medieval bedroom, Surrounded by flickering candlelight and freezing stone walls, people did everything they could to guide that journey safely. They adjusted blankets carefully, whispered prayers before closing their eyes, positioned pillows beneath aching shoulders, and settled themselves into raised sleeping positions they believed protected the fragile balance of the human body. Perhaps they were wrong about the humors and vapors, but their fears were very real. Because in the Middle Ages, illness could arrive silently in the middle of the night, and by morning, an entire life might already be slipping away. And as fear of sickness spread across medieval Europe, doctors began offering even stranger advice about how people should sleep, breathe, eat, and survive the dangerous hours of darkness. By the late Middle Ages, the fear of sleeping completely flat had settled quietly into everyday life, not everywhere, not for everyone, but deeply enough that many people no longer questioned it. The idea drifted through castles, monasteries, village homes, and physician writings like an invisible thread connecting generations together. To modern minds, lying flat in bed feels natural, comfortable, healthy, even. But to many medieval sleepers, stretching fully horizontal beneath the darkness of night carried a strange sense of danger. Part of that fear came from simple observation. The seriously ill often struggled most when forced to lie flat. Anyone suffering from lung sickness, fever, heart trouble, or weakness in old age frequently breathed easier while sitting partially upright. Families noticed this. They watched sick relatives prop themselves against cushions through long nights beside fading fires. They heard labored breathing grow calmer once the chest was raised slightly, and over time, these scenes left powerful impressions upon the medieval imagination. If dying people struggled while lying flat, perhaps healthy people should avoid it too. The logic may sound flawed today, but in a world without scientific medicine, experience shaped belief far more strongly than experiments ever could, and fear spreads easily when people lack clear explanations. Throughout medieval Europe, sudden death during sleep seemed terrifyingly common. A person might eat supper, say evening prayers, climb into bed, and never wake again, without knowledge of heart disease, strokes, infections, or respiratory illness. Such deaths felt mysterious, unpredictable. Some believed evil air gathered around sleepers lying too low. Others feared the lungs became compressed during deep sleep, slowly suffocating the body. In many cases, people simply connected flat sleeping with vulnerability itself. When lying completely horizontal, the body appeared helpless, defenseless, too close to the posture of the dead, and that similarity mattered more than we might expect. Medieval society lived in close proximity to death every day. Plagues, childbirth, famine, infection, and harsh winters kept mortality constantly visible. Most people witnessed multiple deaths within their own households during life. Bodies prepared for burial were laid flat. Coffins carried the dead horizontally through narrow village roads, so for some medieval people, sleeping fully stretched out may have carried unsettling symbolic associations with death itself. Remaining slightly elevated created distance from that image. A sleeper upright against cushion still looked alive, alert, present within the world. Religious belief strengthened these feelings even further. Medieval Christianity placed enormous importance on the state of the soul during death. People feared dying suddenly without confession or prayer. Nighttime especially felt spiritually dangerous because sleep resembled surrender. Some sleepers believed remaining partially upright allowed them to wake more easily if illness struck or danger approached during the night, and medieval nights truly could feel dangerous. Fires spread rapidly through wooden homes lit by candles and open hearths. Storms damaged roofs. Thieves moved along dark roads outside villages. Wild animals wandered forests beyond town walls. The darkness itself often felt alive with uncertainty. Inside cramped homes, Many people slept lightly, listening constantly for sounds around them. A raised sleeping position may have offered subtle psychological reassurance, allowing the body to rest while still feeling prepared to respond. Then there were the strange fears surrounding digestion. Medical traditions inherited from earlier centuries warned against sleeping flat immediately after eating heavy meals. Some doctors believed food could rise dangerously upward inside the body during sleep. Others feared lying flat caused poor circulation of internal heat. In noble households especially, late evening feasts were common. Rich meats, bread, wine, and thick stews filled the stomach before bedtime, sleeping elevated. After such meals seemed sensible according to medieval health theory, and slowly, these ideas blended together: medical advice, religious fear, observation of illness, symbolic associations with death. Together they shaped the unusual sleeping habits historians still debate today. But perhaps the most fascinating part is this: many medieval people probably never considered themselves strange at all. Children grew up watching parents sleep against pillows, travelers encountered similar sleeping arrangements in inns and monasteries, doctors repeated familiar warnings generation after generation. What seems bizarre to us simply became ordinary to them, and yet, despite all these fears, medieval sleepers still longed for comfort. After exhausting days of labor, farming, travel, and survival, people climbed into bed hoping for warmth and peace beneath the darkness. Candles dimmed slowly, wind whispered against shutters, the last voices faded into silence, and somewhere beneath heavy blankets, a sleeper adjusted their cushions carefully, settling into a raised posture believed to protect body and soul alike. Outside, the medieval world disappeared into shadow. Inside, countless people drifted toward sleep, convinced they were resting the safest way possible. But the deeper medieval medicine explored the mysteries of the human body. The stranger the advice became, because physicians of the Middle Ages developed entire systems of rules about sleep, and some of their recommendations sound almost unbelievable today. The medieval doctor entered the room slowly, carrying far more confidence than certainty. Candles flickered against the folds of his dark robes. Bundles of dried herbs hung from his belt. Under one arm rested a thick handwritten manuscript filled with ancient medical teachings copied generation after generation across centuries. To the people of the Middle Ages, physicians stood somewhere between science and mystery. They studied the body carefully. They observed symptoms. They memorized old texts from respected scholars, but they also believed illness could be influenced by invisible vapors, planetary movements, seasonal imbalances, and spiritual corruption. And when it came to sleep, medieval doctors offered advice that feels deeply strange to modern minds, yet at the time, these instructions were treated with remarkable seriousness. According to many physicians, sleep was one of the most dangerous and important activities of human life. Too much sleep weakened the body, too little damaged the mind. Sleeping at the wrong hour disrupted digestion, sleeping in the wrong position invited illness. Even the direction a sleeper faced could become a matter of concern. Medical texts warned that the body changed dramatically after sunset, internal heat shifted inward during the night, digestion slowed, the brain filled with vapors rising from the stomach. Because of this, doctors believed the sleeping body required careful management. One common recommendation involved posture. Many physicians advised patients not to lie completely flat after meals, especially heavy meals containing meat or wine. They feared food would not settle properly within the stomach. Instead, sleepers were encouraged to recline gently upward using bolsters and pillows. The position was believed to support healthy digestion while protecting the lungs and heart from dangerous pressure. Some doctors even suggested changing positions throughout the night. Beginning sleep on the right side supposedly aided digestion, turning later onto the left balanced bodily heat. Sleeping face upward for too long risked allowing harmful vapors to rise toward the brain, and sleeping face down was often considered deeply unhealthy altogether. The body, according to medieval medicine, constantly required balance. Everything depended on harmony between heat and cold, moisture and dryness, movement and rest. Doctors frequently prescribed unusual bedtime routines intended to preserve this balance. Patients were told to avoid emotional excitement before sleep. Anger heated the blood dangerously, sadness cooled the body too much, fear disturbed the heart. Even conversation late at night could supposedly interfere with healthy rest. Some physicians recommended gentle music before sleep, others advised reading religious texts or listening to calm prayers to quiet the mind. Bedrooms themselves became carefully controlled environments. Fresh air was useful in moderation, but cold drafts were feared intensely. Doctors warned against sleeping beneath open windows during winter. Night air was thought to carry dangerous moisture capable of entering the body during unconsciousness. Blankets therefore became medical tools as much as sources of comfort. Too few coverings exposed the body to illness, too many trapped unhealthy heat inside the sleeper. And then there were the more unsettling recommendations. Certain medieval physicians believed sleep immediately after intense laughter weakened the heart. Others warned that sleeping during thunderstorms exposed the body to harmful atmospheric changes. Some advised placing aromatic herbs near the bed to purify the air. Rosemary, lavender, sage, and mint were commonly scattered around sleeping chambers, not merely for pleasant fragrance, but because people believed scent itself influenced health. Strong foul odors were associated with disease and corruption. Sweet herbal smells symbolized cleanliness and protection. Wealthy households sometimes filled bedrooms with expensive perfumes and dried flowers before bedtime. Meanwhile, doctors also obsessed over the timing of sleep. Sleeping too early disrupted digestion. Sleeping too late exhausted the mind. Afternoon naps were acceptable in moderation, especially during hot weather, but excessive daytime sleep supposedly weakened natural bodily rhythms. The ideal sleeper remained disciplined, controlled, balanced carefully between exhaustion and wakefulness, and beneath all these strange recommendations lingered one enormous truth. Medieval medicine was trying desperately to explain a world filled with suffering it could not fully understand. Doctors watched patients die from infections they could not cure. They observed plague spreading invisibly between homes. They listened helplessly to coughing that lasted for months, so they searched constantly for patterns. If one sleeping posture appeared helpful, they recommended it. If warm herbs seemed comforting, they prescribed them. If elevated sleep eased breathing in the sick, they encouraged others to imitate it. Their theories often sound misguided today, but behind the strange advice was a genuine desire to protect life during dangerous times, and for ordinary medieval people lying awake beside flickering candles. These instructions offered reassurance, a sense of control against the uncertainty of illness and darkness. So night after night, sleepers adjusted their cushions carefully. They avoided cold air. They followed familiar bedtime rituals handed down through generations. And somewhere in the shadows of the medieval bedroom, the line between medicine, superstition, and comfort slowly disappeared. But while ordinary people followed the advice of physicians, the wealthy elite transformed sleep itself into something almost theatrical. High above the sleeping villages below, the castle remained awake long after sunset. Torches flickered along stone corridors. Guards moved quietly across narrow staircases. Cold wind pressed against thick fortress walls that had endured centuries of storms, wars, and winters, and hidden deep within those enormous castles were the private chambers of the nobility. To modern eyes, medieval castles often appear grand and luxurious. But many noble bedrooms were far colder, darker, and more uncomfortable than people imagine today. Stone absorbed winter air relentlessly. Huge halls echoed with emptiness. Smoke drifted constantly from fireplaces and candles. Yet despite these hardships, Noble sleeping chambers represented some of the most carefully designed spaces in medieval society, because sleep for the wealthy was not simply about rest, it was about status, security, power. The noble bedroom existed as a world of ritual and symbolism all its own. As evening settled over the castle, servants began preparing the chamber hours before bedtime. Candles were lit carefully one by one. Heavy curtains around the bed were drawn shut to trap warmth. Fresh linens were arranged neatly across feather mattresses. Sometimes warming pans filled with glowing coals were carried beneath the blankets to remove the terrible cold waiting inside the bed. The process resembled a ceremony more than an ordinary nightly routine. And at the center of the room stood the bed itself. Large carved bed frames towered above the floor like wooden monuments. Rich fabrics hung from every side. Velvet curtains softened the harshness of the surrounding stone walls. Some noble beds sat elevated on platforms, separating sleepers physically and symbolically from everyone else inside the room, because even private bedrooms were rarely truly private. Servants often remained nearby throughout the night. Ladies in waiting slept close to noble women. Trusted attendants guarded chamber doors. In royal courts, important visitors were sometimes received directly inside bedchambers themselves. Kings discussed politics from bed. Queens received guests while reclining against embroidered cushions. The bed became both furniture and stage, and naturally, sleeping posture became part of that visual display. Nobles were frequently shown resting partially upright, surrounded by layers of luxurious pillows. The position appeared elegant, controlled, dignified. Completely sprawling across the mattress may have looked improper within aristocratic culture. A raised posture reflected refinement and discipline even during sleep. Paintings and tapestries from the late medieval period often show noble sleepers reclining almost regally beneath heavy blankets while attendants move quietly nearby with candles or trays of wine. To modern viewers, these images feel strangely formal, but medieval nobility lived inside a culture where appearances mattered constantly. Every movement reflected social rank. Even bedtime carried rules, and comfort itself was different from what we expect today. Feather mattresses softened the surface somewhat, but noble beds remained heavily structured. Large bolsters naturally lifted the head and shoulders. Thick blankets added weight rather than softness. Curtains enclosed the sleeper tightly, trapping body heat but also creating still enclosed air around the bed. Within this cocoon-like space, resting slightly elevated likely felt practical as much as fashionable, and despite their wealth, nobles still feared illness deeply. In fact, the wealthy often worried about health even more intensely because they had greater access to physicians and medical advice. Doctors visited castles regularly. Herbal remedies filled noble chambers. Detailed routines governed meals, bathing, and sleep. Many aristocrats genuinely believed elevated sleeping protected the lungs, improved digestion, and prevented dangerous nighttime sickness. Fear lingered constantly beneath the luxury. The memory of plague outbreaks haunted noble families just as it haunted peasants. A fever inside the castle walls could spread rapidly among servants and household members. At night, every cough sounded alarming in the silence of stone corridors. And then there was the danger of the castle itself. Medieval castles were safer than village cottages in many ways, but they were not peaceful places. Political enemies existed everywhere. Poisonings, betrayals, and nighttime attacks were real fears among powerful families. Some nobles slept lightly with weapons kept nearby. Guards remained posted outside doors until dawn. Within that atmosphere of tension and uncertainty, sleeping upright against cushions may have offered psychological comfort as much as physical relief. The posture felt prepared, alert, less vulnerable than lying completely flat beneath the darkness. And yet, despite all the rituals and protection surrounding noble sleep, the night still carried immense loneliness beyond the heavy curtains and candlelight. Castles could feel enormous and empty after midnight. Wind echoed through towers, footsteps faded into distant corridors, the fire burned lower beside the bed, and somewhere inside those vast stone chambers, a noble sleeper rested upright beneath embroidered blankets, listening quietly to the sounds of the castle breathing through the darkness. But while nobles surrounded themselves with luxury and servants, most ordinary people slept in conditions far more crowded and difficult, and their nighttime world looked completely different from the castles towering above them. Far from the towering stone castles and candlelit noble chambers, another world of sleep unfolded quietly across medieval Europe, a world smaller, colder, and far more crowded than most modern minds can easily imagine. In peasant homes, sleep was never separated from daily life. There were no private bedrooms, no carved wooden beds enclosed in velvet curtains, no quiet corridors guarded by armored sentries. Instead, sleep happened wherever space allowed, often in the same room where meals were cooked, where tools were repaired, where animals sometimes sheltered during harsh winters. A peasant house was not divided into specialized spaces the way homes are today. It was a single living environment that changed purpose depending on the hour. By day, it was a workspace. By night, it became a shared sleeping hall. As evening arrived, families began the slow process of preparing for rest. The hearth was the center of everything. Its fading fire determined warmth, light, and safety throughout the night. Children gathered closer to it as darkness thickened. Adults arranged simple bedding across the floor. Straw was spread carefully to create soft enough ground for sleep. Worn blankets were unfolded and shared between bodies. In wealthier villages, a simple wooden bed frame might exist in the corner of the room, but even then, it was often shared by multiple people or reserved for the elderly or sick. Most people slept close to the ground. Not out of choice, but necessity. Space inside peasant homes was limited, warmth was fragile, and winter nights were long enough to test endurance itself. Families slept together in tight arrangements, bodies positioned to conserve heat. Parents often placed children between adults to protect them from cold air drifting through gaps in the walls. Infants were wrapped in cloth and kept close to sleeping bodies for warmth and safety. Even animals sometimes shared the same space. A goat or chicken might be kept indoors during extreme cold, adding both warmth and noise to the night. The result was a sleeping environment that was crowded, warm, and constantly alive with small sounds, breathing, shifting, occasional crackles from the dying fire, wind brushing against thatched roofs overhead. Privacy, in the modern sense, did not exist. But within this shared space, something important developed, a rhythm of collective survival. Everyone slept differently depending on age, strength, and position within the household. Older members often leaned against walls or wooden beams. Younger children curled beneath blankets near the center of the room. Healthy adults sometimes slept lightly, ready to respond if something went wrong during the night. And once again, we see how sleeping posture naturally adapted to environment. In cramped spaces where bodies were pressed together, lying fully flat was not always practical. People often rested with knees bent, back supported by bundles of cloth or folded straw, or half reclined against low wooden structures. Sleeping slightly upright was not unusual here either. It was simply a response to limited space and uneven surfaces. The peasant bed was not designed for comfort in the modern sense, it was designed for survival. Straw mattresses flattened quickly under weight. Dust and insects were common problems. Fresh bedding was difficult to obtain and had to be reused repeatedly, yet families did what they could to improve conditions. Straw was shaken and replaced when possible. Wool blankets were carefully preserved for generations. Simple linen cloths were washed in rivers or shared among households. Even small improvements mattered deeply in a world where warmth meant life. During winter, the bedroom sometimes became nearly indistinguishable from the rest of the house. Smoke from the hearth drifted slowly through the room, warming the air but also leaving a constant haze near the ceiling. In storms, wind found its way through cracks in wooden walls, causing shadows to flicker across sleeping bodies. Rain tapping against roofs created a steady rhythm that accompanied sleep itself, and yet, despite discomfort, exhaustion always won. After long days of farming, repairing tools, tending animals, or walking long distances, sleep came heavily and without resistance. Bodies settled into straw and fabric. Firelight dimmed, voices faded into silence, and in that silence, the shared sleeping space became strangely intimate. Families remained close even in rest, breathing in rhythm, warmth shared across bodies, the boundaries between individual and group dissolving under layers of blankets and darkness. There was no separation between living and sleeping life, everything existed in the same space. And as medieval Europe moved through seasons of hardship and survival, these humble sleeping arrangements quietly shaped how ordinary people understood rest itself, not as luxury, not as comfort, but as something deeply tied to community, warmth, and endurance. Yet even among peasants, beliefs about health, illness, and nighttime danger still influenced how people positioned themselves during sleep, because no matter how simple the home, the night always carried uncertainty. And in the next chapter, we step even closer to that shared human experience, where sleeping beside family, strangers, and travelers became part of everyday life across the medieval world. In the modern world, a bed usually belongs to one person, or at most two. It is private, personal, a quiet boundary separating one life from another. But in the Middle Ages, that idea would have felt almost strange. Beds were not individual spaces, they were shared environments, often with family, sometimes with servants, occasionally with travelers or strangers passing through for the night. Sleeping alone was not the norm. It was a privilege inside medieval homes, especially among ordinary families. Space was limited to the point where separation simply was not possible. One bed might serve an entire household, or at least a significant portion of it, and so, night after night, people lay down together under shared blankets, shaped as much by necessity as by tradition. Parents slept alongside children, older siblings protected younger ones by staying close, infants were carefully wrapped and placed between bodies to keep them warm through the cold hours. The bed became a living arrangement rather than a personal object, and within that shared space, something deeply human emerged, a sense of collective safety. In a world where nighttime brought real dangers, cold, illness, fire, and uncertainty, sleeping close to others offered reassurance. Warmth was not just physical, it was emotional, a quiet comfort found in the presence of breathing bodies nearby. Even in wealthier households, shared sleeping was common. Servants often slept in the same chamber as their employers, ladies-in-waiting stayed close to noble women, children might be placed in the same large bed or on adjacent sleeping pallets within the same room. Privacy existed only in fragments, and those fragments were often defined by curtains rather than walls. Heavy fabric sometimes surrounded beds, creating the illusion of separation, but sound, movement, and presence still passed easily through them. A cough in the night, a child shifting under blankets, a servant adjusting bedding near a candle's glow. Everyone was aware of everyone else, and yet, medieval people adapted to this shared intimacy without the discomfort modern readers might assume. For many, it was simply normal life. Sleeping arrangements reflected trust as much as necessity. To share a bed meant sharing warmth, sharing protection, sharing vulnerability during the most unguarded hours of existence. In colder regions, this became even more important. Winter nights could be brutally unforgiving. Stone walls absorbed heat quickly, fireplaces burned low by midnight, drafts slipped through cracks in wooden structures. Under such conditions, bodies became the most reliable source of warmth, so families naturally gathered together, layered beneath wool and linen. They created small ecosystems of heat that made survival more comfortable. Even posture was influenced by proximity, with multiple people occupying a single bed. sleeping fully stretched out was rarely possible. Bodies adjusted instinctively, some leaned slightly upright against shared pillows, others curled inward to make space. Children often slept in flexible positions between adults, shaped by the limited room available. This was not considered unusual, it was practical living, and within this closeness, a quiet rhythm formed through the night. Breathing synchronized unconsciously, movements echoed softly between sleepers. The bed became a shared experience rather than separate individual rest, but shared sleep also came with challenges. Noise was unavoidable, snoring, shifting, occasional coughing, all part of the nightly soundscape. Illness, too, could spread more easily within close sleeping groups, and in times of plague or fever, entire households could be affected rapidly. Yet despite these risks, separation was rarely an option. Space remained too limited, warmth remained too valuable, and so people continued to sleep together. Even emotional life was shaped by this closeness. Parents could feel the presence of children throughout the night. Siblings developed an awareness of each other's movements even in darkness. Couples shared not only affection, but also the responsibility of maintaining warmth and safety. Night became a shared experience rather than an individual retreat. In some households, especially during travel or pilgrimage, this practice extended even further. Strangers might share sleeping spaces in inns or monasteries. Beds were divided by simple partitions, or sometimes not divided at all. A single room could hold multiple sleepers arranged closely for warmth and safety, and in such environments, trust became essential. But perhaps most interesting of all is how naturally people accepted this way of sleeping. There is little evidence suggesting widespread discomfort or confusion about it. Instead, historical records suggest a quiet normality. This was simply how life worked. Over time, children grew into adults without ever knowing a world of private bedrooms or individual beds. They carried those habits forward into their own families, repeating the same patterns of shared sleep across generations, and within that continuity, sleep itself became something communal, not isolated, not separate, but deeply connected to the people closest in life. Yet even in these shared spaces, subtle variations in sleeping posture still appeared. Some people leaned more upright, others reclined fully when space allowed, and many adapted their position depending on comfort, illness, or habit. In the quiet corners of medieval bedrooms, sleep was shaped not only by belief or habit, but by objects, simple things, soft things, everyday items that determined how a body rested through the long hours of night. Among them, none were more important than pillows, bolsters, and bed curtains. To a modern eye, a pillow is a small comfort, a soft rectangle meant for rest, but in the Middle Ages, pillows carried a far greater purpose. They were not just for comfort, they were structural. The medieval bed was rarely flat or evenly supported. Mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers often shifted, sagged, or formed uneven surfaces over time. Wooden frames could creak and tilt slightly. Floors beneath were sometimes cold, uneven, or drafty, so pillows became tools of adjustment. They lifted, balanced, supported, especially the upper body. Large bolsters, long cylindrical cushions, were placed beneath the back or shoulders to raise the sleeper into a gentle incline. Smaller pillows filled the gaps around the body, preventing cold air from slipping into open spaces. Over time, these arrangements naturally encouraged a semi-upright sleeping posture, not always by belief, but often by design. In wealthy homes, pillows were carefully crafted from linen, wool, or feathers, and covered in embroidered fabric. Some were richly decorated, showing patterns, symbols, or family crests. In poorer homes, pillows were simpler, sometimes just folded cloth, sometimes sacks filled with straw or hay. But regardless of wealth, the purpose remained similar: support the body through a long, uncertain night. And then there were bed curtains, perhaps one of the most visually striking features of medieval sleeping spaces. Heavy fabrics hung from wooden posts or ceiling frames, surrounding the bed on all sides. To modern readers, they may seem decorative, but their purpose was deeply practical. In winter, bed curtains trapped warmth. They created a small insulated space where body heat could remain concentrated through freezing nights. They also protected sleepers from drafts, an ever-present problem in stone castles and wooden cottages alike. But bed curtains served another role as well: privacy. In a world where multiple people often shared the same room, curtains created the illusion of separation, a boundary between inside and outside, between the sleeping body and the surrounding world. When drawn closed, the bed became its own enclosed space, a small chamber within a larger room. Inside that space, light softened, sounds became muffled, the outside world felt distant. Candles flickering beyond the fabric turned into blurred shadows, voices became indistinct murmurs. For many sleepers, this enclosure created a sense of safety, and within that safety, pillows and bolsters completed the structure of rest. A body was not simply laid down, it was arranged, head supported, back elevated, arms positioned carefully among layers of fabric and cushioning. In some households, the arrangement of pillows became almost ritualistic. Before sleep, cushions were adjusted in familiar patterns. Bolsters were placed with practiced care, blankets were layered with attention to both warmth and posture, and once everything was set, the sleeper settled into a position that often remained unchanged for hours. The semi-upright posture, so often seen in medieval illustrations, was not always intentional at first. It emerged naturally from the materials available: thick bedding, stacked cushions, enclosed curtains, cold environments. Together, they created conditions where elevation felt stable, warm, and secure. But beyond practicality, there was also emotion. Being surrounded by cushions and curtains created a feeling of enclosure that many medieval people associated with protection. The bed became a contained world, a sheltered space away from uncertainty. Outside it, the night remained unpredictable. Inside, everything felt controlled. Even dreams, in medieval belief, were influenced by the arrangement of the body and the environment around it. A poorly supported head might lead to disturbed sleep, a cold draft might bring uneasy dreams. A restless posture might signal imbalance in the humors, so pillows were not just comfort, they were part of maintaining harmony. In noble households, bed curtains and cushions sometimes became highly elaborate. Silk fabrics, embroidered edges, and layered textiles created an almost architectural sleeping space. A bed could resemble a room within a room, a structure of softness built inside stone walls, and when the curtains were drawn, the sleeper disappeared into that enclosed world. From the outside, only faint candlelight and the shifting outline of fabric revealed that anyone was there at all. But even in simpler homes, the principle remained the same: a few folded cloths, a bundle of straw, a rough curtain or hanging fabric near the bed, small attempts to shape sleep into something more controlled, and through it all, the body continued to adapt, adjusting, settling, finding balance between comfort and necessity. The medieval sleeper did not always lie flat, not because they consciously rejected it, but because their environment quietly guided them into another position. One shaped by warmth, structure, and the limited materials of their world. And as night deepened across villages and castles alike, countless sleepers rested inside these small enclosed spaces. Surrounded by fabric, cushions, and shadow, slowly drifting into sleep, held upright by the very objects meant to comfort them. But even in these carefully arranged beds, fear never fully disappeared, because beyond the curtains, beyond the pillows, beyond the walls, the night still carried the unknown. In the medieval world, night was not simply a time for rest, it was a time of uncertainty, a time when the body felt more fragile, and a time when illness seemed to move quietly through the darkness, unseen and unpredictable. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, people often felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of their homes. Rooms grew colder, shadows deepened, even familiar spaces began to feel unfamiliar, and within that stillness, the human body became the center of attention, because in the Middle Ages, sickness rarely arrived with clear explanation. It appeared suddenly, it worsened quickly, and sometimes, it took life within days. A cough that seemed harmless in the afternoon could become severe by morning. A fever could rise overnight without warning. Breathing could grow heavier as the night deepened. Without modern understanding of germs or internal disease, these rapid changes felt mysterious, almost invisible forces moving through the body while the world slept, and so, nighttime became associated with risk. Many people believed that illness was more likely to reveal itself during sleep, not necessarily caused by sleep itself, but discovered within it. The stillness of the night made symptoms more noticeable: breathing, sweating, restlessness, weakness. Families often kept quiet watch over one another during long winter nights. A parent might wake briefly to check a child's breathing. A spouse might listen for irregular sounds beside them. In larger households, someone might remain half awake near the hearth, tending both fire and family. Sleep was never fully disconnected from vigilance, especially when sickness had already appeared in the household. Medieval homes were deeply vulnerable to illness spreading between members. Shared beds, shared rooms, shared air, all made transmission feel almost unavoidable, even if people did not understand the mechanism behind it. So when someone fell ill, fear often spread quietly alongside them, and in that fear, sleeping position once again became important. If lying flat made breathing harder for the sick, then raising the upper body seemed like a natural response. People observed this repeatedly. A sick person propped against cushions often seemed more comfortable than one lying completely horizontal. They coughed less violently, they breathed with less strain, and so elevation became associated with relief. Relief became prevention, and prevention became habit. But beyond physical symptoms, there was also emotional fear, the fear of not waking up. In a world where sudden death during sleep was not uncommon, many people went to bed with a quiet uncertainty lingering in their thoughts. Would they wake in the morning? Would the person beside them still be breathing? Would the night pass safely? These questions were rarely spoken aloud, but they were felt deeply, especially during times of widespread illness. When plague or fever moved through villages, nighttime became even more tense. Families slept lightly, if at all. Candles were sometimes kept burning longer than usual. Prayers were whispered before closing eyes, as if words alone could guard against invisible danger. In such moments, sleep itself felt fragile, a suspension between life and something unknown. Even dreams were sometimes interpreted as warnings. A disturbing dream might be seen as a sign of imbalance within the body, or a spiritual message about approaching illness. The boundary between physical health and spiritual condition was not clearly defined. Everything was connected: body, mind, soul, night. And because of this, medieval people developed many small habits to feel safer before sleep. They might adjust their bedding carefully, open or close windows depending on belief, place herbs near the bed to purify the air, or ensure their head was positioned slightly higher than their feet. Each action carried meaning. Each action created a sense of control, because control was what the night often took away. And yet, despite all these fears, people still slept. Exhaustion always arrived eventually. After long days of labor, travel, or household work, the body demanded rest. Even in fear, sleep was unavoidable, so people adapted. They learned to sleep lightly, to wake easily, to listen even while resting. The medieval night was not deep unconscious escape, it was a layered experience of rest and awareness, silence and sensitivity, and somewhere within that balance, sleeping posture once again reflected both caution and comfort, a slightly raised body, a carefully arranged head, a position that allowed easier breathing and quicker waking if needed, not always by design, but often by habit shaped through generations of observation and fear. As candles burned low and the wind moved across rooftops, medieval sleepers settled into their beds with a quiet awareness of the world around them, not fully trusting the night, but enduring it. And as we move further into medieval sleep culture, we begin to see something even deeper emerging. Beneath all these fears, a belief that darkness itself was not empty. When the sun disappeared in the Middle Ages, it did not feel like the simple end of a day, it felt like a transformation of the world itself. Light did not just fade, it retreated, as if something unseen was pulling it away, and in its place came darkness that felt alive. For many medieval people, night was not empty, it was inhabited, not only by people sleeping in their homes, but by forces that could not be seen or easily explained. The human imagination filled the silence of darkness with presence, whispers of spirits, unseen watchers, and strange movements just beyond candlelight. Inside homes, families would often finish their evening routines quickly as night deepened. Doors were secured, fireplaces were reduced to glowing embers, curtains were drawn tightly around beds. These actions were not only about warmth or comfort, they were about protection from what the night might bring. In medieval belief systems, the boundary between the physical and spiritual world was thin, very thin, so thin that it could be crossed in sleep. Dreams were especially important in this understanding. A dream was not just mental imagery, it could be a message, a warning, or even a visitation. Some people believed that spirits could enter dreams to communicate with the living. Others feared that harmful forces could disturb sleep and cause nightmares or illness. A restless night was not always seen as random, it could have meaning. Because of this, bedtime often included small rituals meant to create safety. Simple prayers whispered before closing the eyes, signs of the cross drawn quietly over the body, objects placed near the bed believed to offer protection. Herbs like rosemary or sage were sometimes kept nearby, not only for smell, but for symbolic defense against harmful influences. Even the position of the body mattered in some traditions. Sleeping slightly upright, supported by pillows and bolsters, was sometimes believed to keep the sleeper safer from unseen disturbances during the night. Not all beliefs were religious, some were folk traditions passed quietly through generations, stories told by candlelight, warnings from elders, local customs shaped by fear and experience. In rural villages, tales of night spirits were common, figures said to wander roads after dark, strange sounds heard near forests, movement seen at the edge of vision when no one should be there. Whether people fully believed these stories or not, they still influenced behavior, because the night itself was already uncertain, and uncertainty naturally gave rise to imagination. Inside castles, even the wealthy were not immune to these feelings. Stone walls were strong, but they also echoed sound in strange ways. Wind could move through corridors and create noises that seemed almost intentional. A creaking beam might sound like footsteps, a distant draft might feel like presence. In such environments, the mind easily turned silence into something meaningful. Monasteries, too, had their own relationship with nighttime belief. Monks and nuns often lived in structured environments with strict schedules of prayer. Even in darkness, they followed routines that gave shape to the night. But even there, the idea of spiritual presence during sleep remained strong. Night was seen as a time when the soul was more open, more vulnerable. Because of this, sleep was not considered a complete escape from awareness, it was a transition into another state of being, between waking life and something less defined, and in that space, protection mattered. The bed itself became part of that protection. Curtains drawn around the sleeper created a sense of enclosure, a boundary between the body and the unknown. within that enclosed space. People could feel temporarily separated from the wider darkness outside, and once again, sleeping posture entered the picture. A raised body, supported by cushions and bolsters, did not just help with physical comfort or breathing, it also created a feeling of readiness, less exposed, more alert, closer to waking life even during sleep. This alignment between belief, comfort, and fear shaped many nighttime habits. People adjusted their bedding carefully not only for warmth, but for peace of mind. They arranged pillows in familiar ways, ensured doors were secured, and often kept small sources of light burning longer than necessary, because complete darkness was unsettling, not just visually, but emotionally. Yet despite these fears, people still fell asleep. Exhaustion softened fear over time. The body eventually surrendered to rest, no matter what the mind believed, and in that surrender, medieval nights continued as they always had, quiet, uncertain, filled with both rest and imagination. As centuries passed, many of these beliefs slowly faded or transformed, but for those living in the Middle Ages, darkness was never just absence of light, it was a space filled with meaning, memory, and unseen possibility. And as we move further into medieval sleep culture, we begin to see how even monks and nuns, people devoted entirely to spiritual life, experience the night in ways that shape their sleeping habits in surprising ways. Far from the crowded villages and echoing castles, another kind of life unfolded in silence. Monasteries and convents, places where time itself seemed to move differently, measured not by markets or seasons alone, but by prayer, discipline, and the slow rhythm of bells marking the hours of the night. At first glance, it might seem that religious life would bring peaceful sleep, but in the Middle Ages, even sleep inside monasteries was shaped by strict order, cold stone, and constant awareness. Monks and nuns did not simply go to bed in the modern sense. Sleep was part of a structured system of life, and even rest was guided by rules. As evening prayers ended, the monastery would fall into a carefully maintained silence. Candles were extinguished one by one, stone corridors grew colder, footsteps faded into soft echoes, and the community moved together toward shared sleeping spaces. Unlike noble castles, monastic dormitories were often large, communal rooms. Rows of simple beds or straw-filled pallets lined wooden floors or stone halls, no heavy curtains, no private chambers, only shared space, shared silence, and shared vulnerability. The air inside these rooms was cool, sometimes damp, always still, and yet, even in simplicity, there was structure. Beds were arranged in order, senior members closer to certain areas, younger members in others, everything placed with quiet discipline. Personal comfort was not the focus, spiritual discipline was, but the human body still demanded rest, and so, monks and nuns adapted to their environment just like everyone else. They layered blankets carefully against the cold, they used simple cushions or folded cloth beneath their heads, and they often slept in a slightly elevated position when possible, especially in colder seasons when breathing and warmth became important concerns. Stone buildings held winter air stubbornly. Even with wool coverings, the cold remained close. Sleep, in these conditions, was never entirely deep. It was light, alert, interrupted by the smallest changes in sound or temperature. But what made monastic sleep unique was not only the environment, it was the structure of the night itself. Monastic life did not allow for uninterrupted rest. The night was divided, not by personal preference, but by prayer. At certain hours, bells would ring through the monastery, echoing across sleeping halls. Monks and nuns would rise, sometimes in complete darkness, to gather for prayer, then return to rest again. Sleep came in segments, shaped by devotion as much as exhaustion. Because of this, the boundary between waking and sleeping life was always thin. A person might fall asleep fully aware they would soon be called again. There was no complete surrender to the night, only temporary rest between moments of duty. And yet, within this structured interruption, a strange calm existed. The repetition of routine created security. Even in darkness, there was predictability. Stone halls, familiar sounds, the soft movement of others nearby, and always the presence of shared silence. In some monasteries, sleep was also seen through a spiritual lens. Rest was not just physical recovery, it was preparation. A quiet state in which the soul could be closer to reflection, prayer, and divine awareness. Because of this, sleep posture still mattered in subtle ways. Many slept in positions that allowed easier waking, slightly elevated heads, carefully arranged bedding, bodies oriented for readiness rather than deep unconsciousness. Even rest carried discipline. Dreams, too, were sometimes considered meaningful within monastic life, not as superstition, but as reflections of inner thought, struggle, or spiritual condition. A restless dream might prompt reflection, a peaceful one might bring quiet reassurance. But always, interpretation remained grounded in contemplation rather than fear. Outside the dormitories, the night continued across fields and forests. Wind moved over stone walls, stars shifted slowly above cloisters, and the world beyond the monastery remained distant, almost unreachable. Inside, however, life continued in cycles of rest and prayer, sleep and waking woven together, and as hours passed, monks and nuns would rise again to the sound of bells, stepping once more into cold corridors and dim candlelight, not fully rested, not fully awake, but continuing the rhythm of a life shaped by devotion. In this way, monastic sleep was never truly separate from the rest of existence. It was simply another form of passage, between silence and sound, between night and prayer, between exhaustion and purpose. And as we move further through the medieval night, we begin to see how even travel and movement shaped sleep in ways far removed from both castles and monasteries, because not everyone had a place to return to at all. When winter arrived in the Middle Ages, it did not simply change the weather, it changed the entire experience of living indoors. Rooms that felt tolerable in autumn suddenly became cold, damp spaces where breath turned visible and stone walls seemed to absorb every trace of warmth. There was no central heating, no insulated glass windows, no reliable way to trap heat evenly inside a building. Instead, people lived closely with fire. And fire, in winter, became the center of survival. As daylight faded early in the afternoon, households began preparing for the long night ahead. Wood was gathered carefully, because every log mattered. The hearth was lit and tended with attention. Doors were checked for drafts, windows were closed tightly, though they rarely sealed completely. But even the strongest fire could only warm a small part of a room. Beyond its glow, cold remained present, constant, quiet, persistent. In castles, the situation was not much better. Stone walls absorbed winter air and held it like stored ice. Large halls were difficult to heat fully, even with multiple fireplaces, so people adapted. They did not try to warm entire rooms, they warmed themselves instead. Beds became the primary source of heat during the night. Before sleep, servants or family members would prepare carefully. Thick blankets were layered, straw mattresses were fluffed. Bed curtains were drawn tightly to trap body heat inside small enclosed spaces. In wealthier homes, heated stones wrapped in cloth were placed near the feet or sides of the sleeper. In some cases, metal warming pans filled with embers were slid beneath bedding before a person climbed into bed. The goal was simple: create a pocket of warmth inside a cold world. And once inside that pocket, sleep became a very different experience. People often went to bed fully dressed in layers of clothing, wool garments, caps to cover the head, socks or wrapped feet, sometimes even cloaks worn indoors at night. Undressing completely was not always practical, especially in colder regions, because once the body lost heat, it was difficult to regain it. And this constant struggle with cold influenced sleeping posture in subtle but important ways. Lying completely flat exposed more surface area to cold air that seeped through blankets, and gaps, curling slightly inward, helped conserve warmth, and raising the upper body against pillows or bolsters often reduced direct contact with colder bedding beneath. Over time, this created sleeping positions that were partly shaped by necessity rather than choice. Inside bed curtains, the air was still, but not warm in the modern sense. It was simply less cold, breath gathered under fabric. Faint candlelight flickered and slowly died out. The world outside the bed felt distant, but not fully gone, and yet, even in freezing conditions, medieval people still developed a strange familiarity with winter nights. They understood the patterns of cold, which corners of a room would freeze first, how wind moved through cracks in walls, which blankets held warmth longest, which positions allowed the body to endure the night more comfortably. Sleep became an adaptation to environment as much as a biological need. In rural homes, families often gathered closer together during winter. Bodies were shared sources of heat, children slept between adults, animals were sometimes brought indoors to add warmth to the space. The entire household functioned like a single system of survival against cold, and through all of this, sleep remained fragile. People woke easily during winter nights. A drop in temperature, a shift in wind, a crack in the fire. These small changes could disturb rest instantly, so sleep was lighter, more sensitive, more aware of surroundings even in unconsciousness, and in that lightness, people often adjusted themselves repeatedly during the night, pulling blankets closer, shifting position to avoid cold drafts, raising shoulders slightly to stay above the coldest air near the floor. Even turning in bed could become a conscious effort, and yet, despite discomfort, there was also a strange quiet beauty to winter nights. The world outside slowed down, snow softened sound, fires glowed steadily in darkness, homes felt enclosed in small islands of warmth surrounded by cold silence. Inside that silence, sleep became something deeply intimate, a shared endurance of cold hours, and for all the hardship, people still found rest. Not perfect rest, not comfortable rest by modern standards, but enough to carry them through the season. As winter deepened, medieval nights shaped habits that would remain for centuries, influencing how people arranged beds, bodies, and warmth long after the Middle Ages had passed. And even as spring eventually returned, the memory of winter remained in how people prepared for sleep, because in a world without central heating, the night was never just darkness, it was cold itself, waiting patiently beyond the glow of the hearth. As night deepened in the Middle Ages, sleep rarely arrived in silence alone. It was often preceded by ritual, small, repeated actions performed not out of habit alone, but out of belief that the night needed preparation, and the sleeping body needed protection. Before lying down, many medieval people paused for a moment of stillness. The room would already be dim by then, candles reduced to soft flickers, fireplaces glowing gently in the background, shadows stretching slowly across wooden beams and stone walls. And in that quiet space, bedtime became something more than rest. It became preparation for vulnerability. One of the most common rituals was prayer, not elaborate ceremonies, but simple words spoken softly before sleep, the request for safety through the night, a hope of waking again in the morning, a quiet acknowledgement that sleep carried uncertainty. In homes and castles alike, people often made the sign of the cross before closing their eyes. This gesture was believed to offer protection not only against illness, but also against unseen dangers thought to move through darkness. Some whispered specific prayers learned in childhood. Others spoke more freely, shaping their own words in moments of personal fear or reflection. In monasteries, prayers were structured and formal. In villages and homes, they were deeply personal and varied, but the intention remained similar: to create a boundary between the sleeping body and the unknown night. Alongside prayer, many households followed additional bedtime customs, Some people placed small objects near the bed believed to offer protection: a wooden cross, a worn religious charm, a small piece of cloth touched during prayer. Others kept herbs nearby: rosemary, lavender, sage, or thyme were often chosen for their scent, but also for their symbolic association with purity and safety. These objects were not seen as decoration, they were part of sleep itself. Even the act of preparing the bed could become ritualized. Blankets were arranged in a specific order, pillows were adjusted carefully, curtains were drawn slowly, almost ceremonially, enclosing the bed in its own small world. In wealthier households, attendants sometimes assisted with these preparations, ensuring everything was placed correctly before the noble sleeper entered the bed. The process was quiet and deliberate, a transition from public life to private vulnerability, and once inside the bed, more subtle rituals continued. Some people touched the bedding 3 times before lying down, others briefly paused in silence, listening to the final sounds of the household settling for the night. There was a moment, often unnoticed in historical records but deeply human in nature, when the world outside seemed to pause completely, and then sleep began. But even after lying down, not all activity stopped. Many medieval people adjusted their position several times before fully resting: a pillow shifted, a blanket pulled closer, a body turned slightly to find warmth or comfort, and once again, sleeping posture became part of ritual as much as necessity: a slightly raised head, a carefully supported back, a body arranged in a way that felt safe within the enclosed space of bed curtains or shared rooms. These small adjustments were often guided by memory and belief as much as comfort, because in the medieval mind, sleep was not just physical rest, it was a transition, a passage into a state where the boundaries of body and spirit felt thinner. Dreams, in particular, were taken seriously by many people. A dream might be seen as reflection, as warning, as message. So bedtime rituals were also meant to influence what might be experienced during sleep itself. A peaceful prayer could lead to peaceful dreams. A disturbed mind might bring unsettling visions. Whether or not this was true mattered less than the feeling it created. Ritual gave structure to uncertainty, and in a world where illness, cold, and sudden death were real concerns, structure brought comfort. Even superstition had its place in this system. Some people avoided certain words before sleep, believing they might invite misfortune. Others ensured beds were oriented in specific directions, following local tradition or inherited belief. These practices varied widely from place to place, but everywhere, the idea remained consistent: night required respect, and sleep required preparation. Over time, these rituals created a rhythm that guided medieval evenings. Work ended, fire dimmed, prayer began, beds were arranged, and finally, the body settled into rest. Within that rhythm, even fear became familiar. The darkness outside remained unpredictable, but the actions inside the home followed patterns that people trusted, and that trust, however small, made sleep possible. As centuries passed, many of these rituals slowly changed or faded, replaced by new understanding and new habits, but the desire behind them never disappeared, the desire to feel safe before closing the eyes. And as we move deeper into medieval sleep culture, we now arrive at one of the most fascinating ideas of all: the way people divided their nights into 2 separate periods of sleep, shaped by silence, waking hours, and the rhythm of darkness itself. In the deep hours of medieval night, long before clocks ruled every moment of life, sleep itself was not always a single uninterrupted journey. For many people in the Middle Ages, the night came in 2 parts: a first sleep, a waking interval, and then a second sleep. This pattern was not written into law, it was not enforced by rulers or churches, it was simply how many people naturally experienced the night. After sunset, households would settle into their first sleep, the fire would burn low, candles would be extinguished or left flickering faintly, beds filled with layered blankets, straw mattresses, and shed bodies would grow still. The first sleep usually lasted several hours. It was deep and heavy at first, as exhaustion from the day finally released its grip on the body. Farmers, craftsmen, servants, and travelers all sank into rest after long hours of labor. But sometime around midnight, something changed, not suddenly for everyone, but gradually across households. People would wake, not because of alarm clocks or schedules, but because their bodies naturally shifted out of deep sleep. This waking period between two sleeps was considered normal. Some people stayed in bed, lying quietly in the darkness. Others rose briefly. They might tend the fire, adding small pieces of wood to keep warmth through the night. They might check on animals or household members. They might sit in silence, thinking, praying, or simply listening to the world outside. In villages, faint signs of life could sometimes be seen during this hour. A dim light in a window, a figure moving near a hearth, soft footsteps across wooden floors. The night was not entirely paused, it breathed in two cycles, and during this quiet interval, something important often happened: reflection. Without the demands of daytime work, people used this middle period of night for thought. Memories surfaced easily, worries became clearer, prayers felt more personal. Some people prayed specifically during this time, believing the stillness of the world made their words more meaningful. Others simply rested in silence, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, and then, after some time, sleep returned. This second sleep was often lighter than the first. The body had already rested deeply, so the mind drifted into a softer, more fragile state of rest. Dreams were more likely to occur during this phase, movements were more frequent, the awareness of surroundings remained slightly stronger. In many medieval households, morning did not feel like a sudden transition from sleep to wakefulness. It felt like the end of a long, divided night. Gradually, this two-part sleep pattern shaped how people understood time itself. Without artificial lighting or strict schedules, night was defined by natural rhythm rather than fixed hours. The first sleep marked the beginning of rest, the second sleep carried people toward dawn. And between them lay a quiet, shared human experience that connected households across entire regions. Interestingly, historical records, including letters, medical texts, and writings from early modern periods, suggest that this segmented sleep pattern was widespread. Not rare, it appears across cultures and regions influenced by medieval European life, and yet, it was never discussed as unusual, because for the people living it, there was nothing unusual about it at all. It was simply night. But this rhythm also influenced other aspects of medieval sleep. The waking interval between sleeps created opportunities for small nighttime activities, reading by candlelight in noble homes, quiet conversation in family rooms, tending to illness or children, or simply sitting in contemplation beside dying embers. This middle hour of the night carried a unique atmosphere. The world felt suspended, neither fully active nor fully asleep, and within that suspension, sleep became something flexible rather than rigid. People did not always expect to remain unconscious from evening to morning. They expected interruption, awakening, return to rest. This expectation may also explain why medieval sleepers were often light sleepers by modern standards. Environmental sounds mattered. Temperature changes mattered. Movement within the room mattered, because waking in the middle of the night was not a disruption, it was part of the pattern, and once again, sleeping posture subtly aligned with this rhythm. A body resting slightly upright, supported by pillows and bolsters, could more easily transition between sleep and wakefulness. It allowed quicker awareness if needed during the night. It supported the idea of segmented rest rather than continuous unconsciousness. In this way, posture, environment, and sleep cycle all work together, not through design, but through lived experience over generations. Eventually, as centuries passed and artificial lighting, industrial work schedules, and modern lifestyles emerged. The pattern of first and second sleep slowly faded in many parts of the world, but traces of it remain in historical memory, in literature, in medical texts, in forgotten descriptions of quiet midnight hours. And perhaps even in the way some people today still wake briefly in the middle of the night, without understanding why, a quiet echo of an older rhythm, one that once shaped entire nights. And as we move forward in our journey through medieval sleep, we now turn to those who experience the night not in homes at all, but on roads, in forests, and in constant motion, travelers, pilgrims, and wanderers who had no fixed place to sleep. For most medieval people, night meant returning home, a familiar bed, a shared room, a hearth that marked the center of safety, but not everyone had that comfort. Some people were always in motion, travelers, pilgrims, merchants, messengers, and those simply forced onto the road by necessity. For them, night was not a return, it was a challenge. When daylight faded on a medieval road, everything changed almost instantly. Paths that felt manageable in daylight became uncertain. Lines through darkness, forests thickened into walls of shadow, fields lost their shape. Even familiar routes could feel strange when visibility disappeared, and so travelers learned to prepare for night in advance. Stopping before full darkness was important, because once the sun was gone, movement became dangerous. Without streetlights or clear signage, wandering after dark could easily lead to injury, getting lost, or encountering unsafe terrain. So travelers searched for shelter early. Sometimes an inn appeared along the road, a modest building with a flickering lantern outside, offering warmth, food, and shared sleeping space. Inside, rooms were often crowded. Straw bedding spread across floors, simple wooden benches, shared blankets passed between strangers. Privacy was rare, but safety was present. Other times, no inn was available. In those moments, travelers relied on barns, abandoned structures, or even the open ground. A hayloft became a temporary bedroom. A stable offered warmth from animals. A roadside shelter or simple alcove might serve as protection from wind and rain. The goal was always the same: survive the night. When sleeping outdoors, travelers often chose locations carefully, near walls or trees to block wind, away from low ground where water might collect, close enough to roads for orientation, but not so close as to be exposed. Fire, if allowed, became essential. A small flame offered warmth, light, and a sense of control against the darkness around them, but it also required caution. Fire could attract attention, animals, or unwanted visitors, so it was kept low. Carefully managed, often reduced to glowing embers before sleep, travelers rarely slept deeply. The unfamiliar environment made rest lighter, more alert. Every sound mattered, a branch snapping nearby, wind shifting through grass, distant movement beyond visibility. The body remained partially aware even during sleep, ready to respond. And here, sleeping posture once again adapted to circumstance. Fully lying flat on uneven ground was often uncomfortable and impractical. Instead, travelers frequently rested in semi-upright positions, leaning against trees, propping themselves against sacks or saddles. Using cloaks or packs as makeshift cushions, sleep became flexible, not a fixed posture, but an arrangement shaped by terrain and safety. For pilgrims traveling long distances to sacred sites, nights carried additional meaning. Prayer often accompanied rest, a quiet blessing before lying down. A moment of reflection under open sky, a sense that even in travel, they remained within a larger spiritual journey. In inns, shared sleeping spaces brought strangers together in close proximity, different backgrounds, different destinations, all resting in the same room. This closeness required trust, even if temporary. Belongings were kept close, weapons or tools stayed within reach. Awareness of others remained present even in rest, and yet, despite these challenges, travelers still found sleep, Exhaustion from walking long distances often overcame discomfort, feet aching, bodies strained, the need for rest overriding caution, and so sleep arrived in fragments, light, interrupted, sensitive to surroundings, but still sleep. Morning brought movement again. The breaking of camp or departure from inns happened early, often with minimal delay, because travel in the Middle Ages was governed by daylight. Night belonged to rest, however imperfect, day belonged to motion, and between those two states, travelers lived a life defined by transition, never fully settled, never fully secure, always adapting, and yet, there is something quietly universal in their experience, the need for rest, even in uncertainty, the search for shelter, even in unfamiliar places, the ability of the human body to surrender to sleep despite imperfection, whether beneath carved ceilings or open skies, sleep still came. And as we continue deeper into medieval life, we now turn from travelers on roads to entire communities living through a single night in a shared rhythm of village life, where every house, fire, and sleeping body formed part of one quiet landscape. When the sun disappeared behind the horizon in a medieval village, the entire world seemed to slow down at once. Fields that had been full of movement during the day became still silhouettes, paths between houses faded into darkness, and the small cluster of homes that made up the village began to glow softly from within. One by one, lights appeared in windows, not bright lights, but small, flickering sources of warmth, candles, oil lamps, fireplaces. Together, they created a scattered constellation across the sleeping landscape. A medieval village at night was not silent in the modern sense, it was alive with subtle sound, the crackle of fires, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of wind moving through thatched roofs, occasional footsteps on wooden floors, but above all, there was a shared rhythm, every household preparing for sleep in its own way. Yet at the same time, inside each home, the evening began with closing routines, tools were set aside, doors were secured, animals were brought closer to shelters or inside small enclosures attached to homes, fireplaces were tended carefully, because fire was both comfort and risk. And then, gradually, the focus shifted from activity to rest. In peasant homes, the main room transformed into a sleeping space, beds of straw were spread across the floor, blankets were unfolded, families gathered close together for warmth. Children were settled first, often near the center of the room where heat from the hearth lingered longest. Adults arranged themselves around them, forming protective layers against the cold. The fire became the heartbeat of the house, its glow determined everything: warmth, safety, visibility, even mood. As it dimmed, the room changed, shadows grew longer, sound softened, the air cooled slightly, and sleep slowly approached. But not all villagers experienced the night in the same way. In wealthier homes within the village, wooden beds and simple partitions might offer slightly more structure, yet even there, shared spaces and limited heating meant that sleep was rarely fully private or fully separate. As people settled into bed, sleeping posture once again reflected environment. Some lay flat when space allowed, others leaned slightly against bundled cloth or wooden supports. Many naturally adopted semi-upright positions, especially near the fire where heat rose unevenly and drafts moved along the floor. Comfort was not uniform, it was improvised. Outside, the village changed character entirely. Empty pathways stretched between houses, gardens, and fields disappeared into darkness. Only occasional movement disturbed the stillness, perhaps a late traveler, a night watchman, or an animal moving between shadows. In some villages, a watchman or guard would walk slowly through the streets, listening for unusual sounds, not constant vigilance, but periodic presence, a reminder that someone was awake while others slept. Inside homes, however, sleep deepened. The first hours of the night were often the deepest, especially after long days of labor. Farm work demanded physical effort, Crafts required long concentration, household tasks filled every available moment, so when night came, exhaustion was immediate, bodies sank into bedding quickly, breathing slowed, the sounds of the household gradually faded, but even in sleep, the village remained connected, walls were thin, rooms were close together. Sounds traveled easily. A child crying in one home might be faintly heard in another, a late fire being tended could cast shifting light through cracks in walls, even silence was shared, and then, as in many parts of medieval life, the night did not always move in a straight line. Some villagers would wake briefly during the darker hours, to check the fire, to adjust blankets, to listen to the wind outside. The village moved through phases of sleep and wakefulness together, without coordination, yet in parallel rhythm. By late night, the entire settlement felt suspended, not active, not fully asleep in a deep modern sense, but resting, existing in a quiet balance between life and stillness. And as dawn approached, that balance slowly shifted. The sky lightened first, barely visible at the edges of the horizon. Roosters began to call in the distance, smoke from chimneys thickened as fires were rekindled. One by one, homes stirred, doors opened, water was drawn, breakfast fires began, and sleep, no matter how fragmented or deep, came to an end. A new day began not with sudden change, but with gradual return to motion, and within this cycle, medieval villagers experienced night as something shared, not isolated within individual rooms or private routines, but woven across the entire community, a collective experience of darkness, rest, and quiet survival. And as we move into the final chapter, we step back to ask a larger question: whether people truly slept sitting up as often as history suggests, or whether something more subtle is hidden beneath centuries of interpretation. By now, a strange image has formed in our imagination: medieval people sleeping upright, leaning against pillows, resting in semi-seated positions through the long hours of night. It appears in illustrations, in descriptions, and in modern retellings of medieval life, but the real question is more complex than it first seems. Did everyone really sleep sitting up in the Middle Ages? The short answer is no. But the longer answer reveals something far more interesting. Medieval sleep was not uniform. It was not a single, fixed posture shared by all people across Europe. Instead, it was flexible, shaped by environment, wealth, health, climate, and habit. In castles, some nobles rested on soft, layered beds with bolsters and cushions that naturally encouraged a slightly raised posture. In monasteries, sleepers often lay on simple pallets, usually flat or only slightly supported, depending on comfort and cold. In peasant homes, people slept close to the ground, often curled or stretched depending on space, warmth, and the presence of others. And among travelers, posture was dictated entirely by terrain, leaning against walls, sacks, trees, or whatever support was available. So where did the idea of sleeping sitting up come from? Part of the answer lies in objects. Medieval beds were not flat, modern mattresses. They were uneven, lead structures filled with straw, feathers, or cloth. Over time, these materials compressed and shifted. To improve comfort, people used bolsters and multiple pillows. These supports naturally lifted the upper body, not fully upright like sitting in a chair, but elevated enough that modern observers might describe it that way. Especially in artistic depictions, medieval and later Renaissance artwork often shows people reclining at angles that look upright to modern eyes. But these images were not always literal representations of sleep. Sometimes they were symbolic. A resting noble might be shown partially upright to emphasize dignity, alertness, or status. A sick person might be shown elevated to suggest care or treatment. A religious figure might be depicted in a posture of contemplation rather than true sleep. Over time, these visual traditions influenced how later generations imagined medieval rest. Another important factor was health belief. medieval medical theory often suggested that posture could affect the body's internal balance. Elevating the upper body was sometimes recommended for digestion, breathing, or illness recovery, so in cases of sickness, semi-upright sleeping was more common, not because everyone always slept that way, but because it was considered helpful in specific situations. Cold weather also played a role. In unheated rooms, curling or sitting slightly upright could reduce exposure to cold surfaces and drafts, but again, this was adaptation, not universal practice. The reality is that medieval people slept in many positions, flat on their sides, curled under blankets, half reclined against supports, shifted between positions through the night. Just like people today, their bodies adjusted unconsciously to comfort and environment. The difference is that medieval environments were far less controlled. Temperature changed inside rooms. Beds were uneven, space was shared, light and darkness were extreme, so posture became more fluid. Another reason this idea persists is the way sleep itself was described in historical texts. Writers often focused on notable or unusual cases, illness, nobility, ritual, or symbolic moments. They did not document everyday sleeping posture in detail, because it was considered too ordinary to record, and so modern readers are left piecing together fragments, art, medical notes, household descriptions, travel accounts. From these fragments, a simplified image sometimes emerges, but reality was layered and inconsistent. Still, there is a subtle truth behind the misconception. Medieval sleep was often more upright than modern sleep in certain contexts, not as a rule, but as a response. A response to illness, to cold, to shared beds, to uneven bedding, to limited space. In other words, posture was shaped by life, not tradition alone, and perhaps that is the most important insight. Medieval sleep was not defined by a single position, it was defined by adaptation. Every night, bodies adjusted to circumstances, sometimes flat, sometimes curled, sometimes elevated, always practical, always temporary. And as we reach the final part of our journey, we begin to see how all these variations, castles, villages, monasteries, travelers, rituals, fears, and rhythms come together into one long evolution, the slow transformation from medieval sleep habits into the modern idea of rest we know today. But the night itself has never truly changed, only the way we try to control it. The medieval night did not disappear suddenly, it faded slowly, across centuries. Habits shifted quietly, reshaped by architecture, technology, medicine, and the changing rhythm of human life. What once felt natural, shared beds, segmented sleep, candlelit darkness, and flexible posture, gradually transformed into something very different: a single bed, a private room. A continuous night of sleep expected from evening to morning, but this modern pattern was not always the norm. It was something that emerged over time. As towns grew into cities, homes began to change, rooms became more specialized, walls became stronger and more insulated, beds became standardized and more comfortable. The development of glass windows reduced drafts, better construction materials helped trap heat, and slowly, indoor environments became more stable. With stability came change in sleep itself. The need to share beds for warmth gradually decreased, separate sleeping spaces became more possible, privacy became a design feature, not a luxury reserved for the highest ranks of society, and with this shift, sleeping posture also changed. Without cold stone walls pressing in or shared bodies providing warmth, people no longer needed to curl inward or lean against bolsters for survival. Flat mattresses became the standard. Soft, even, predictable surfaces replaced layered straw and uneven bedding. At the same time, cultural ideas about sleep evolved. the growing influence of modern medicine began to separate superstition from physiology. Nightmares were no longer seen as messages from unseen forces, sleep position was no longer tied to spiritual protection, and dreams became understood more as mental activity than external communication. Electric lighting changed everything further. For the first time in history, night was no longer completely dark. People could extend their waking hours far beyond sunset. Work, reading, and social life continued late into the evening. This shift gradually compressed sleep into a more continuous block. The old rhythm of first sleep and second sleep faded in many places. The body adapted, but slowly, and yet, even today, echoes of the medieval night remain. People still sometimes wake briefly in the middle of sleep, still adjust pillows and positions unconsciously, still seek comfort in layered bedding and enclosed spaces. The human body has not completely forgotten older rhythms. But perhaps the most striking difference between then and now is not just how we sleep, but how we think about sleep. In the Middle Ages, sleep was not separate from life, it was woven into it. Shared spaces, shared fears, shared warmth, shared nights shaped by necessity and belief. Today, sleep is more private, more controlled, more predictable, but it is also more fragile in new ways. Noise, stress, screens, and artificial light have replaced cold and darkness as the primary challenges. Different world, different pressures, same need for rest. And so, when we look back at medieval sleep, at upright postures, shared beds, candlelit rituals, segmented nights, we are not just observing a strange past. We are seeing a different version of something universal, the human effort to find rest in an unpredictable world. Because whether in a stone castle, a crowded village, a monastery dormitory, or a roadside shelter, the goal was always the same: to close the eyes, to survive the night, and to wake again into the morning. As the centuries moved forward, sleep became quieter, softer, more private, but the night itself remained unchanged, dark, uncertain, and always waiting. And perhaps that is the final thought the Middle Ages leaves behind. Not that people once slept differently, but that every age shapes sleep in its own way, and one day, even our modern nights may look just as strange to those who come after us.